cities have been a tremendous force for positive transformation throughout the world, whether in the cities of the West, where they were the places where the Industrial Revolution grew, the places where new ideas were formed, the birthplaces of democracy, and increasingly in the less developed world in which cities are providing pathways out of poverty into prosperity. And indeed, when you look in the developing world, the people who live in cities tend to say that they're much happier than people who live in rural areas. However, there are, of course, some cities in the US and elsewhere where people actually say that they're unhappy. And in the US, the centers of unhappiness tend to be the declining cities of the Rust Belt in particular. But also, in fact, people in New York City tend to say that they're less happy as well. Now, there are a couple of themes of the paper that I try to put forward, one of which is this unhappiness is historical, it's not new. This is not the result of decline, but rather cities in the Rust Belt were built for other purposes than making their residents happy. And as a result, over time, as people have gotten richer, as industry has become mobile, they've moved to places where they're happier. They've moved from places that are productive but less happy. Now, the important corollary of this is it's a different view of happiness than has often prevailed in the economics profession. So it has often been taken as gospel that happiness is equivalent to what economists call utility, by which I mean simply that the point of human life is to maximize happiness, is that we should be all trying to become as happy as possible. I think this evidence pushes against that interpretation of our species, that in fact happiness is one of many things that we try to get. It's a good thing, but it's hardly the only thing. And when you think about the people who went to Detroit in 1940, they weren't necessarily happier than they would have been elsewhere, but they were able to earn more money, they were able to buy a better life for their family and for their children. Certainly when we look across cities, the presence of universities is incredibly powerful in terms of predicting urban success. Those places that have these land-grant colleges have done much, much better than those cities that have not. I mean, more broadly, right, as we think about cities in the 21st century, the big evolution of the past 150 years is that the one-time urban edge of moving goods, of the fact that the point of the city was the port and you put the factory near the port because it was cheaper to move the goods, that's become largely irrelevant with declines in transportation costs. That it is now easy to locate factories far away from anywhere else and put it in the lower cost locale. But what's amazing is that despite this, cities have come back. And they've come back not despite globalization and new technologies, but because of globalization and new technologies. That what these forces have wrought is that there's been a huge global increase in the returns to being smart, in the returns to new ideas, in the returns to innovation. And at our heart, we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. That's what cities do today, and that's what they've always done. In some sense, this is a focus on what is really the most essential and most important element in cities, and that's been going on for thousands of years. Well, of course, segregation connects with what we've just been talking about, that when people live in ghettos that are cut off from the larger city, then children growing up in these areas don't receive the huge benefits of being in the maelstrom of ideas, of knowledge. They don't actually get to take advantage of the things that cities do that are most important. They live in a world unto itself. I think it's not clear that we have great tools for social engineering in this world. We know that there are some things that can do tremendous harm. So public housing or social housing projects that segregate the poor, that provide sort of fixed units that the poor people have that tend to mean that they live only with other poor people. Those are much worse than, let's say, giving the poor housing aid with the form of vouchers that enables the poor to move to different areas. And of course, I think most importantly, in terms of creating integration, is making sure that kids have access to good schools. And that means not just neighborhood schools, that means the ability to go to schools that are more mixed in a variety of ways if they choose it. I think that the public tendency in the form of a housing crisis tends to be to do too much rather than too little. I mean, certainly we saw this in the US context. There was a tremendous push to, reboot the housing market and push housing prices back up, where it was very, very hard to, in a world in which you massively overbuild housing housing prices need to fall, new households need to form and occupy the houses, and you gradually need to work your way through the overhang. I think you do want to make sure that there aren't artificial barriers that stop the housing from being sold. So, I think making sure that you have the right policies around bank regulation can be particularly helpful. Ultimately, the most important economic development strategies for cities are to attract and train smart people and then more or less get out of their way, right? Which is not a recipe for laissez-faire, because in fact, attracting smart people and training smart people is hard work on the part of governments. It means it requires safety, it requires good land use planning that makes spaces that are fun. It requires good land use planning that's permissive enough to build enough relatively inexpensive new housing for people to come to. It means having public spaces that are exciting and fun. It means that you haven't overregulated restaurants or stores. So all of these things, which are the traditional business of urban life, are critical, I think, in terms of making cities vibrant and economically successful. Barcelona, I think this is sort of a remarkable urban champion in the 21st century, in a city that is sort of very well poised to succeed on the virtue of sort of a very high quality of life combined with a lot of smart people already being here. So I'm certainly continue to be enormously optimistic about the city of Barcelona.